Somewhere in the pine-covered hills of central Washington, there's a patch of ground that swallows sound. People who have stood at its edge describe a silence so complete it feels like pressure against the eardrums, as though the forest itself is holding its breath. For decades, this place existed only as a rumor whispered between late-night radio listeners, a story too strange to be true and too persistent to disappear. Then someone finally lowered a camera into it. What came back up changed everything, and not in the way anyone expected. This is the story of Mel's Hole, and of the footage that made an entire online community go quiet with fear. The story begins with a phone call to a late-night radio program built around strange phenomena and unexplained events. A man identifying himself only as Mel phoned in, calm and unhurried, and described something impossible sitting on his own property near a small town in the shadow of the Cascade Mountains. He said there was a hole in the ground, one he had stumbled across while working his land, and that nothing about it behaved the way a hole should. Mel explained that he had tried to measure its depth using spools of fishing line, feeding line into the darkness for what eventually added up to more than 15 miles, and never once felt the line go taut against a bottom. No dirt, no water, no stone, just an endless drop that consumed everything fed into it without resistance. He was not trying to sell anything or build a following. He sounded almost bothered by his own story. A man who had found something he did not want and could not explain. He was not finished there. Mel claimed that animals refused to go near the hole. Dogs would stop dead in their tracks at a certain distance and would not be coaxed any closer. Birds seemed to avoid flying directly over it, veering off course as though some invisible current pushed them away. He said the air around the opening felt thick, almost syrupy, in a way that made people uneasy without being able to explain why. For years, he claimed, locals had used the hole as an informal dump, tossing in broken appliances, scrap metal, and even the carcasses of dead livestock. None of it ever made a sound on the way down. No thud, no splash, no distant echo. Everything simply vanished into the silence. Long before Mel ever purchased the land, people already treated the area with caution. Older residents spoke of a name given to the region generations earlier, a name that carried weight and warning rather than casual description. The land was considered wrong somehow, not haunted in the traditional sense, but structurally strange, as if it did not entirely belong to the world around it. Warnings passed down through families were not about ghosts or monsters. They were about staying away from ground that behaved like it did not follow the same rules as everything surrounding it. In the years following the broadcast, a handful of curious locals attempted their own crude experiments. Rope-weighted lures, homemade-sounding devices lowered by hand. Every attempt ended the same way, with equipment running out of length before ever finding resistance. Nobody who tried walked away with an answer. Several described a lingering unease afterward, a feeling that the ground itself had been watching them the entire time. For a long while after that first broadcast, the story faded into the background noise of late-night radio lore, filed away alongside 1,000 other tales that never quite went anywhere. Scientists who eventually heard about the claim were quick to dismiss it, and they had good reason to. Basic geology makes a bottomless hole essentially impossible. The deeper you go beneath the surface, the hotter and denser the surrounding rock becomes. Pressure builds to the point where solid stone begins to behave more like slow-moving putty than rigid material. A vertical shaft extending for miles, without any lining or support, would collapse under its own geological weight long before reaching anywhere close to 15 miles down. The deepest hole ever drilled by human engineers, a scientific borehole project undertaken by Soviet researchers on the Kola Peninsula, took over 2 decades of continuous effort and still only managed to reach a little more than 7.5 miles before the heat became unmanageable. Drill bits melted. Equipment failed. The rock at that depth behaved so unpredictably that continuing became physically impossible. And that was with industrial drilling rigs, immense funding, and a dedicated engineering team working around the clock. Mel, by contrast, claimed to have measured more than double that depth using little more than a pulley system and ordinary fishing line, with no reported ground instability, no seismic activity, and no structural collapse anywhere nearby. To geologists, the claim did not just stretch credibility, it broke it entirely. And yet, If the story was so easily dismissed as impossible, why did it refuse to go away quietly? According to Mel's later accounts, strange things began happening not long after his story reached a wide audience. Unfamiliar vehicles started appearing near his property, parked at odd angles along roads that rarely saw traffic. He described unfamiliar footprints pressed into soft ground where no one should have been walking. He said he began to feel watched, a persistent, low-grade sense that his land was under quiet observation. Then, according to his own retelling, official-looking personnel arrived at his property wearing protective gear and carrying clipboards, restricting access to his own land under the justification of an unspecified safety incident nearby. Mel said he never saw any wreckage, any emergency crews, or any news coverage to support the claim. He was simply told to stay away. Not long after, he alleged he was offered a substantial yearly payment on the condition that he leave the country permanently and never discuss the whole publicly again. He said the offer came with an unmistakable undertone of consequence should he decline, including a vague threat involving fabricated legal trouble that could have resulted in serious prison time. Whether every detail of that account holds up to scrutiny remains impossible to verify, but Mel maintained that shortly afterward, he boarded a flight out of the country and disappeared from public life entirely. For years, nothing. No further calls, no updates, no trace. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he resurfaced and called into the same program that had first carried his story. The man who spoke this time sounded noticeably different. His voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by a slower, more hesitant cadence. He described gaps in his memory he could not account for, unexplained scarring on his body, and vague recollections of medical procedures he had no memory of consenting to. He spoke of waking in unfamiliar places, with no understanding of how he had gotten there, as though pieces of his own timeline had been quietly removed. Despite all of this, he stood firmly behind his original story, and added something new. There was, he claimed, a second location, this one hidden somewhere in the Nevada desert, allegedly even more heavily monitored and far more dangerous than the first. He offered few details before the call ended, but the seed had been planted, and it would not stay buried for long. Decades passed, and the tale of the impossible hole might have remained a footnote in the history of strange radio broadcasts, if not for the internet's habit of resurrecting exactly the kind of stories official channels seem eager to forget. Old audio clips resurfaced, chopped into unsettling video montages, layered over shots of dense, fog-covered forest. Online forums built detailed timelines, cross-referencing dates, locations, and claims with the meticulous energy usually reserved for unsolved criminal cases. Short video platforms turned the legend into a challenge, daring viewers to venture into the woods themselves and see what they could find. The tipping point arrived when an anonymous user posted a satellite image alongside a set of coordinates pointing toward a remote ridge in central Washington. At first glance, the image looked unremarkable, just another stretch of wilderness. But zoomed in closely, a strange feature became impossible to ignore. A perfectly circular patch of bare earth, sitting in the middle of otherwise dense forest, with no visible trees, no vegetation, and no trail leading in or out. It looked as though the ground itself had simply been erased. Users cross-checked the coordinates against publicly available land records and found an unsettling match with the vague location details Mel had given decades earlier. Almost immediately after the post gained traction, the corresponding satellite imagery became blurred, the resolution intentionally degraded in a manner reminiscent of how sensitive government installations are sometimes obscured on public mapping platforms. To many observers, that alone felt like confirmation that something worth hiding was actually there. Theories multiplied overnight. Some speculated the formation was a naturally occurring geological feature, perhaps an unusually deep volcanic conduit reaching toward the Earth's mantle. Others leaned into far stranger explanations, suggesting the site marked some kind of tear in the fabric of reality itself, a place where the normal rules governing matter and sound simply stopped applying. If objects dropped into it never made noise on impact, perhaps it was because they never actually landed anywhere at all. What had once been a story confined to insomniac radio listeners was now a fully collaborative investigation, with hobbyists, engineers, and thrill seekers pooling resources and equipment. Small expedition teams began making their way into the forest carrying drones, ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging equipment, and handheld sensors, determined to document whatever they found rather than simply speculate about it from a distance. Early attempts produced strange, inconsistent results. One team reported their navigation equipment malfunctioning the moment they approached the clearing. Another described a drone losing signal entirely as soon as it crossed into the open space. A member of a separate expedition described sudden, unexplained chest pressure while standing near the center of the clearing, along with bursts of static picked up on recording equipment despite no obvious source of interference nearby. By the time a dedicated team finally organized a proper expedition equipped to send a camera into the depths, the story had grown from campfire legend into something resembling an actual investigation. This was not a group of casual thrill seekers armed with phone flashlights. The team included engineers, skeptics, and independent researchers who had spent years chasing unexplained phenomena and had grown tired of second-hand accounts. They wanted direct evidence, and they came prepared to get it. Their equipment reflected that seriousness. A custom-built winch system designed to withstand extreme pressure and temperature swings. A reinforced cable rated for depths far beyond anything a typical rig could handle. A high-resolution camera equipped with low-light capability, paired with thermal and infrared sensors, feeding a continuous data stream back to the surface. Every component had been tested multiple times before the expedition even began. Nobody wanted to risk failure once the descent started. On the morning of the attempt, the clearing sat wrapped in a thin layer of mist. The winch began releasing cable slowly, the camera disappearing into darkness, inch by inch, while the cable unspooled behind it. Above ground, the team huddled around a monitor showing a surprisingly clean, stable feed. For the first several hundred feet, there was nothing especially remarkable to see. Just smooth rock walls that looked almost too uniform, more like the interior of a machined shaft than anything carved by natural processes. No mineral veins, no moss, no signs of water erosion, just an unervingly clean, featureless descent. The silence on the audio feed matched the visual. No dripping water, no settling stone, no distant echo of any kind. Only an oppressive quiet that seemed to grow heavier the deeper the camera traveled. Then the temperature readings began behaving strangely. Instead of climbing as expected with increasing depth, the numbers dropped sharply, eventually reaching readings more consistent with polar conditions than anything found underground. Strangely, the cable itself showed no signs of frost or ice buildup, despite the sensor data suggesting an environment cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Around 300 feet down, something briefly caught the camera's attention. A faint pulse of light, rhythmic and almost deliberate, flickered somewhere beyond the reach of the camera's own illumination. The operator adjusted the angle, trying to locate a source, but found nothing solid to explain it. The light pulsed again, slightly stronger this time, before fading entirely. Deeper still, near the 400-foot mark, the walls appeared to take on an almost reflective quality, as if something glassy had been layered over the stone. The video feed's color balance shifted unexpectedly, and onboard magnetic sensors registered a faint but measurable fluctuation in the surrounding electromagnetic field. The drone's compass readout spun erratically before settling into an orientation that did not match its actual position. To the team watching above, it looked less like equipment malfunction and more like the space itself had subtly shifted shape. At roughly 580 feet, everything on the surface team's monitor seemed to freeze at once. A shape appeared in the frame, tall, narrow, and motionless, positioned squarely between the camera and the wall behind it. It had no discernible features, no clear edges, nothing that resembled a face or recognizable form, yet its presence was unmistakable. It did not move toward the camera or retreat from it. It simply existed there, as though it had been waiting the entire time for something to finally look its way. Seconds later, the feed cut to black. No warning signal, no static burst, just an abrupt and total loss of transmission. The winch operator confirmed the cable remained slack and undamaged, and the team began reeling it back to the surface immediately. When the equipment finally emerged, the camera housing showed no visible damage, yet every recorded file after that final frame had been wiped clean, as though something had reached back along the connection itself. The team packed up in near total silence. Nobody spoke much on the walk back to their vehicles. It was not the disappointment of a failed mission weighing on them, but the unsettling certainty that they had recorded something that was never meant to be observed. Back at their base of operations, they spent hours reviewing the surviving footage frame by frame, stabilizing shaky sections, enhancing low-light segments, and slowing down the final moments before the blackout. What they found in that process only deepened the unease already settling over the group. Once processed, the footage barely ran 10 minutes from start to finish, but its impact online was immediate and enormous. Viewers fixated on the temperature anomalies first, readings that defied basic thermodynamic expectations for anything occurring naturally underground. Then came the light pulses, which some analysts insisted followed an almost rhythmic pattern, not unlike breathing, or possibly some kind of signal. Audio engineers who examined the recording found something even stranger. Around the 500-foot mark, a low, resonant hum appeared on the track, growing steadily louder before fracturing into short, layered bursts that some listeners swore resembled distorted whispering. Spectrogram analysis produced wave patterns that did not cleanly match any known natural phenomenon, prompting wild speculation ranging from some kind of geological resonance to an entirely unfamiliar form of communication. Then there was the shape itself, the tall, motionless figure caught for only a few frames before the feed died. Enhanced versions of the clip spread rapidly, with viewers debating every visible detail, arguing over whether faint reflections within the shape suggested something resembling eyes staring directly back into the lens. The footage did not stay easily accessible for long. Accounts that uploaded the raw file reported sudden suspensions. Others described corrupted files that would not play back correctly after upload, or entire storage drives that failed without warning shortly after the video had been copied onto them. Some claimed to receive takedown notices from unnamed organizations, providing no clear legal justification for the request. Despite this, copies kept resurfacing under different titles, spreading faster than they could be scrubbed, fueling an ever-growing wave of theories across forums and video platforms alike. Paranormal researchers gave the anomaly various names, describing it as some kind of aware, self-monitoring entity buried far beneath the surface. Fringe theorists proposed a hidden global network of similar sites, each one an entry point into something ancient and largely dormant, occasionally stirring when disturbed. More grounded voices, including a handful of scientists who declined to be publicly named, floated less supernatural explanations involving unusual electromagnetic phenomena or unexplained atmospheric distortions capable of producing sensor anomalies. None of these explanations, however, accounted for the shape captured on camera, or the sensation felt by every member of the expedition that something down there had been fully aware of their presence the entire time. Not long after the footage reached its widest audience, the online trail connected to the expedition simply stopped. The accounts responsible for sharing the original recording went dark, their profiles either deleted, suspended, or abandoned without explanation. Attempts by curious followers to reach team members directly went unanswered. People who had once been active, responsive voices and ongoing discussions vanished entirely, leaving behind unfinished conversations and unresolved questions. Around the same time, renewed satellite imagery of the suspected location returned to its earlier blurred state, mirroring exactly what had happened when the original coordinates first leaked years before. Hikers who ventured anywhere near the general area later reported encountering unmarked vehicles parked in unusual configurations, unfamiliar patrol personnel carrying radios, and a complete absence of any official park or forestry presence to explain who these individuals actually were. Nobody offered identification. Nobody explained why access had been restricted. People were simply turned back, quietly and without discussion.